I was asked today to come and talk to you about managing attachment insecurities in close relationships. And before I do get started, I kind of wanted to start with, actually, before I get started, I do want to just sort of highlight a territorial acknowledgement. So I'm not sure if this is sort of familiar to people in Europe as much, but in Canada, there were settlers here. There was Indigenous communities that were living here before the colonization of Canada. And so I think it's important just to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples whose lands I am currently residing on, whose lands I do my research on. And I think this is just an important sort of signpost to really acknowledge all of the privilege that we have. We're able to work on other people's territory that was taken from them. I also want to acknowledge that, I did my PhD at the University of Auckland. That's where I grew up in New Zealand. And it was sort of a very similar situation there. So I also want to acknowledge sort of the tangata whenua, who are the Indigenous people, the Maori Indigenous communities in New Zealand. So sorry for the little preamble, but I do think it's just something I like to acknowledge and sort of invite other people to kind of think about and reflect on whose lands and territories they may occupy. Okay, so to get started, I wanted to pose this couple to you. This is Alex and Morgan. They are a romantic couple. They've been in a relationship for 3 years, but like many people, they harbor a lot of deep-seated insecurities about themselves. For example, Alex is high in something called attachment anxiety. This is a type of insecurity where people have perhaps historically been theorized to have had inconsistent caregiving from parents or loved ones. And because of that, they tend to develop really chronic beliefs that close others don't truly love them and that they'll eventually abandon them. And so this makes it very difficult for Alex to be in his relationship because he's constantly questioning whether his partner Morgan truly loves him, whether she's going to leave him eventually. And that can create a lot of different sort of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral problems for Alex. On the other hand, Morgan is someone who we could classify as someone being high in attachment avoidance. People who are highly avoidant tend to have caregiving histories where people have been consistently cold and rejecting. And because of that, they learn that they actually can't trust other people, that it's better to just be self-reliant and independent and just focus on the self. And again, similar to Alex, these insecurities that Morgan harbors can make it very difficult for Morgan in her relationship. She finds it difficult to trust Alex, that he's going to be there for her, that he truly is, not going to leave her and abandon her and reject her. And because of that, she finds herself, closing herself off to Alex, making it hard for her to be emotionally vulnerable in their relationship. So when we think about attachment anxiety and avoidance, I want to make sure that people, understand that these aren't categorical insecurities. They exist on dimensions. So for example, attachment anxiety could exist on like an x-axis dimension where people can be relatively low versus relatively high in that type of insecurity. On the other axis, on the y-axis, we have attachment avoidance. And again, people can be relatively low versus high on attachment avoidance. When people are sort of high in anxiety and low in avoidance, we could classify them, more categorically, just sort of to help you with the conceptual framework, as someone who is high in attachment anxiety. Similarly, on the flip side, people who are high in attachment avoidance but low in attachment anxiety would be considered someone who's, avoidantly attached. Importantly, when people are low on both attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance, we would classify them as someone who is secure. So they have a secure attachment to close others. These are people who have had very, loving, caring, and responsive caregiving in their life, both during childhood and adulthood. they have no issues depending and relying on other people, trusting other people. They find it very easy to open up to others. Now, the rates of attachment insecurity and why it's really important to kind of think about this from a psychological perspective is that it's fairly common. So there've been studies where people have examined infants' attachment to their primary caregiver, often the mother, and they find that about 40% of children exhibit some kind of insecure attachment. And often these infants are at about 12 to 18 months old. So before they even hit the age of 2, infants are already demonstrating evidence of these insecurities. Interestingly, when we take a look at attachment insecurity later in adulthood, we see a very similar breakdown. About 40% of adults can be classified as having an insecure attachment style, compared to nearly 60% of secure. If you break this down even more into the sort of distinct categories, we can see that it's about, we still have about 59% or 60% secure individuals. About a quarter of the adults, 25%, tend to be sort of higher in attachment avoidance, about 11% higher in attachment anxiety. And these insecurities, they're really important for sort of downstream effects. From a relational standpoint, I've sort of indicated that the insecurities that people like Alex and Morgan have can have really strong impacts on their relationship. So people who are higher in attachment anxiety and avoidance, they tend to be more dissatisfied in their relationship. They tend to be less committed in their relationship. They tend to be at greater risk for things like conflict, infidelity, and domestic violence. And those relationships tend to be more volatile. They're more likely to break up, end in dissolution or divorce. But attachment insecurity has also been linked to really important health outcomes. So there was a study done by Pugh and colleagues in 2012, and they actually linked people's attachment insecurity at infancy to inflammation-related and non-specific symptoms later in adulthood, when people were well into their 30s. And that was controlling for a lot of health behavior and health indicators. So over and above, people's eating habits, drinking habits, their BMI, whether they exercise, things like that, their insecure attachment was really associated with all of these health outcomes. One of the things that I've been interested in my research program is trying to understand the mechanisms for this. How is it that people's insecurities that they develop when they're very young, how does that actually transfer into all of these, personal health outcomes and relationship outcomes? And one of the things that I think is quite central in understanding this is that attachment insecurities is really about emotion regulation. When an infant is distressed or sad and they turn into a caregiver, what they're hoping to get out of that is that a caregiver will help the infant regulate their emotions, because they don't know how to do that quite yet. They're still learning. But if you have a caregiver who is inconsistent or unavailable, it's going to disrupt people's ability to learn how to regulate their emotions. And that should have downstream impacts, on how people deal with conflict and disagreement, or when things happen unexpectedly in life, people's life stresses as well. And this should have, implications for relationship satisfaction and commitment and dissolution, but also these physical health outcomes. So one of the things that we did in one of our papers is actually take a look at this link more explicitly. So there had been a lot of work that had looked at, infant attachment and how that impacts emotion regulation in children. And we had a lot of information about how adults' self-reported attachment insecurities as adults impact their emotion regulation in adulthood. But what we don't really have good evidence for is actually linking infant attachment insecurity to adult emotion regulation later in life. So I was actually very lucky to be working with Jeff Simpson, who is a very close mentor of mine. And he's been involved in something called the Minnesota Longitudinal Study of Risk and Adaptation. In this study, women who were considered high-risk pregnancies, so these were often women who came from sort of like low socioeconomic status, who perhaps there was no like involved father, who came from marginalized backgrounds and identities. They were recruited at a free health clinic to be part of the study. So these women were enrolled in the study when they were pregnant with their baby. And this study has been ongoing ever since. So the team of psychologists, and both within developmental psychology and relationship psychology, paired up. They were tracking these infants after they were born. And so what we have here is infant attachment of that child to the mother, both at 12 months and at 18 months. And this was assessed using something called the strange situation. So just as a recap, in case people are unfamiliar with this procedure, but the strange situation involves having a mother and the child come to a laboratory in person, and they're playing together. And then the mother is asked to step outside of the room. Now, in pretty much all the cases, children get very distressed at the separation. So all the children sort of cry. But what's sort of really important is what happens when the mother is allowed to re-enter the room and how those children then self-regulate. And based on whether the child is able to calm down versus not calm down, we're actually able to give sort of pretty reliable estimates of, that child's attachment, whether they're feeling secure with the mother or insecure with the mother. So we have those assessments when this child was at 12 and 18 months. The great thing about the study is that they actually tracked this child for the rest of their life. So there's actually a lot that happens in terms of childhood. But what I'm interested in is romantic relationships and how insecurities sort of impact relationships later in life. And so when these children were 20, 23, 26, and 35 years old, they were actually invited to come back into the lab, this time with their current romantic partner. And in the lab, those couples were asked to talk about a very challenging relationship problem. And what we were able to do here is actually rewatch those videos and code the extent to which our primary participant in this study, whether they were exhibiting different types of emotion regulation strategies that were beneficial, and strategies that maybe indicated some kind of dysregulation in how people are coping. This study is actually ongoing. So they're like 40 years into the study now. So it's a really rich data set. And I'm very, very lucky to be able to have been able to work with this team. So as I mentioned, we have ratings of the child's infant attachment with their mother at 12 months and 18 months. And what was interesting is because we have 2 time points, we were actually able to see some sort of like whether their reactions to their mother in these sort of strange attachment situations was consistent over time or not. So we had about 102 infants that we had data across all time points. The first group that emerged was a stable, secure group. This was about 46% of our sample. And these were infants that were rated as being, stable and secure with their mother at both 12 and 18 months. So when the mother re-entered that room, these children very quickly calmed down, were able to calm down and go back to sort of playing and engaging with the environment around them. So this really showed a very good, responsive, secure attachment style. In another group of infants that made about 21% of the sample, they were rated as being insecure, both at 12 months and 18 months. These individuals, when the mother re-entered the room, either they were unable to calm down, or they tend to be very angry at the mother. They would lash out at the mother. Some individuals that sort of had a more avoidant tendency basically pretended like nothing was happening. They were very cold, very subdued, wouldn't look the mother in the eye, would sort of ignore the mother afterward. And so these are all insecure sort of tendencies. And there was a group of infants that were like this very consistently, both at 12 months and at the 18-month time point. Interestingly, we also had a third category of infants. These made up actually about 33% of our sample. And these were infants that were either insecure at one time point and secure at another time point. So the first time point they came in, they may have been insecure, and then the second time point they were secure, or vice versa. And so we labeled this group as being unstably insecure. We then, like I mentioned, had all of these infants come back into the lab like 20 to 35 years later, and they had very difficult, challenging discussions with their partner, relationship problems that they were struggling with. And we actually rated, the extent to which they engaged in hyper and hypo-regulation strategies. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Essentially, here's what we found. Compared to our stable, secure group, infants that had been stably insecure, they were much more likely as adults, more likely to exhibit something called hypo-emotion regulation. This is where individuals are actually suppressing their emotional reactions. So they would be talking about something very challenging, engaging in conflict with their partner, but they would have, they would be suppressing their emotions. They would be giving very superficial answers, being very disengaged and withdrawing from the partner. On the other hand, our unstable, insecure infants, compared to our stable, secure group, were much more likely as adults, likely to engage in something called hyper emotion regulation. And this is sort of the opposite to the hypo emotion. This is when individuals were exaggerating their emotional displays of hurt and anger and distress. They would be focusing so much on themselves rather than their partner. They would be over the top, clingy, and demanding of their partner. So this was, really interesting. I think it was one of the first studies linking how insecurities as an infant plays an important role in shaping emotion regulation well later into adulthood. And this sort of really comes out and plays out in romantic relationship interactions. Now, I will say, I don't think that these processes are specific to romantic relationships. So you probably get very similar reactions occurring when people are having difficult and challenging conversations with maybe a sibling or a friend. But I think a romantic relationship is like an intense sort of context to test some of these ideas. Now, for me, as being someone who's an attachment theorist, what was really interesting is that these infant insecurities, we didn't have adult attachment in the same sort of way in these studies, but it really did map on theoretically to what we should expect of people who are high in attachment anxiety and high in attachment avoidance. So, for example, I mentioned earlier how people who are high in attachment anxiety tend to have had inconsistent caregiving. This is the same as our unstable, insecure infant group, and they were showing hyper emotion regulation, which is what we would expect from really anxious individuals. On the flip side, people who are high in attachment avoidance, they're theorized to have had consistent cold and rejecting experiences. This is our stable, insecure group, and they showed hypo emotion regulation, which again is what you would expect from very, avoidantly attached individuals. So the study really mapped on both, theoretically to emotion regulation literature, child development literature, attachment literature, and of course, the relationship psychology literature as well, to what we should expect in terms of how insecurities should shape people's emotion regulation, especially in these sort of distinct ways, based on whether people are more anxious or avoidant. And so this first study that I talked about, highlighted that consistent caregiving is really important, right? Having someone who consistently shows up for you, is responsive to your needs, that helps people, starting from infancy, to learn how to regulate their emotions, and that helps them even later in life. Whereas people who have had inconsistent or consistently rejecting caregiving, they don't have the opportunity to learn or have their emotion regulation supported. And this can, be very destructive later in life, well into adulthood. So emotion regulation is a really important piece of the puzzle, I think, when it comes to understanding why attachment insecurities have such a detrimental outcome on people's relational and personal well-being. But another thing that I'm particularly interested in is also understanding volatility, fluctuations, chaos, turbulence, tumultuous, processes that can also be related to insecurities. And so I've written a little bit about how romantic relationship dynamics, they're not always linear or stable. Relationships can be, a chaotic roller coaster. Sometimes that's a good thing, like when you're falling in love and you feel, that sense of things being, amazing and spontaneous. But often those fluctuations are not so great, because what people often want in long-term committed relationships is stability, is security. And so having feelings of, turbulence or feeling unsure or, not quite sure if you can really predict what your partner's going to do next, those things are probably not so great for relationship dynamics. And a lot of this is attached, deeply in attachment insecurities, because attachment security is really about feeling that sense of stable, secure, consistent expectation about a partner or a caregiver. And so some other work that I have done is sort of extending the work I looked at in terms of, differences in infant attachment variation, to looking at fluctuations in attachment insecurity in adulthood and how that impacts people's relationship well-being. So one of the things, for example, that I'm really interested in is understanding how do fluctuations in attachment insecurity impact relationship well-being. And that's because, attachment insecurity, it's not just something that people have and then it's stable. It does change, and it can change. Not necessarily for everybody, but for some people it can. So if people are experiencing these sort of within-person ups and downs, these within-person fluctuations, I was interested in, whether that's going to be consequential for a relationship. This is actually some real data from the study, from this project, and each different line is someone's level of, I think this one is attachment anxiety, but you see sort of similar patterns with avoidance as well. But in the study, we assessed people's attachment insecurity to their romantic partner at 4 different time points. So this is, at time point 0, 1, 2, and 3. And what you can see is that there's actually a lot of variability going on, right? Like for some people, like the red line that goes right at the bottom of that chart over here, this is our secure, stable person. So they're really secure at the beginning of the study, and they've remained secure throughout the study with their partner. Then you have someone like this who started off very insecure, but it's unstable. They're experiencing fluctuations, but in a way where they're declining. What's happening to this person is that they started off really insecure, but they somehow ended up being very secure at the end of that year. This green line kind of shows the opposite. This is someone who was secure at the beginning of their relationship. Something happened here. And that, set this person on a trajectory towards insecurity in their relationship. And then the blue line, this person is just all over the place. They start off secure, then they go up to being insecure, then back to secure, then back to being insecure. Similar to this pink line, they're experiencing a lot of ups and downs. And this is meant to be a very stable trait. When we think about attachment and insecurity, people often think about it as like a trait level measure. Yet people are experiencing quite dramatic changes in whether they feel that their partner is going to be there for them, available, responsive to their needs. And these are all established relationships. So you wouldn't expect it to be fluctuating so much. And so in one of the studies that appeared in this paper, what we actually did is we actually just wanted to first do a little, test of hypothesis. Do insecure people expect their relationships to be really turbulent, and do secure people expect their relationships to be really stable? And what we had individuals do is complete a questionnaire. These are just a few items from, it was a 12-item scale, but this is a few items where we asked individuals to, think about their romantic partner and consider whether they think that their relationship will be relatively stable over time, whether it'll be unstable and unpredictable, whether their partner will consistently be there for them, whether the partner will love and care for them, and if that will remain stable over time. So we're really interested in people's expectations of stability and consistency. And this was a cross-sectional survey of about 400 adults, all in established romantic relationships. And we found that individuals who were relatively more secure, so these are people who were low in attachment anxiety and avoidance, they expected that their relationship and that their partner, all of that would be very stable and consistent over time. Whereas insecure individuals, they were much lower on these scales. They expected tumultuousness. They expected things to fluctuate. They expected volatility because that's probably all they've ever known. So in this project, sorry, my cat is meowing very loudly. I might have to just let him in. 1 second, little break. All right, sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so in this project, we had 2 studies. In the first study, we had 324 individuals who were all in romantic relationships, and we had them complete 4 questionnaires, a baseline questionnaire, and then again, every 4 months over 12 months. And at each time point, they reported on their attachment anxiety and avoidance, and also how satisfied they were in their relationship with their partner. In our second project, we had 174 couples. And these were couples who were expecting their first child together. So this one was really great because of the baseline. We had couples complete, again, their attachment anxiety and avoidance towards their partner, how satisfied they were in their relationship. And that was before the birth of their child. And then after the birth of their child, we tracked them every 6 months over 2 years. Again, asking them about their attachment and asking about their relationship. Now, we actually found, so I ran multi-level growth curve analyses for this data. And over here, what I'm showing you is a 3-way interaction of individuals' attachment, whether their attachment at the beginning of the study, whether they experienced relatively low fluctuations, that's the red line, or high fluctuations, that's the green dotted line. And this was their relationship satisfaction over time. I'm showing you an example from study 1, but we got the exact same results in study 2. And what you'll see here is that for people who are high in attachment anxiety and high in attachment avoidance, whether or not they experienced fluctuations or not really made no difference to how satisfied they were in their relationship. So these simple slopes were non-significant. They do not differ from zero. And again, I think part of why this is because insecure individuals, they're used to experiencing fluctuations. So experiencing fluctuations, it just didn't really bother them as much. These are individuals who are low in attachment anxiety and avoidance. So these are individuals who are secure at the beginning of the study. And the red line is the ones that they didn't experience any fluctuations. So they were secure at the beginning of the study and they remained secure throughout the study. And you'll see that their relationship satisfaction maintained itself over time. Now, that's actually a really good thing. You know, romantic relationships are funny that way. You get into it, you're super happy, and over time, you know, people's relationship satisfaction tends to decline. So if these couples were able to maintain their relationship satisfaction over time, that's a good thing. But here's what happens when our relatively secure individuals experienced greater fluctuations. Their relationship satisfaction tanked. So over the span of 12 months in the study and over 2 years after the birth of their first child in the second study, secure individuals who experienced greater fluctuations in their attachment security were much more dissatisfied in their relationships over time. So in a way, this is sort of similar and a nice extension to the infant attachment project that I just mentioned, where greater variability or greater fluctuations and feelings of security towards a romantic partner, you know, that was really detrimental for relationship well-being. And this is especially for secure people who expected their relationships to be stable and consistent. You know, these fluctuations really violated those expectations. They experienced these roller coaster emotions that they weren't expecting, and that tended to be a bad thing for their relationship well-being. So those two projects, you know, some people might kind of ask this question of like, okay, well, does that now mean that people who experience insecurities are sort of doomed to have worse personal and relational outcomes? And, you know, I think the short answer for that is no. So this is actually a figure from Nicola Overall and colleagues' recent review paper that appeared in Nature Reviews. And it was a review paper that looked at partner buffering in attachment. And essentially what that means is that when people are in stressful contexts, like they're experiencing conflict, for example, it tends to activate people's insecurities. And these insecure individuals, you know, they respond poorly. For example, they might engage in worse emotion regulation behavior, right? Like they might withdraw from their partner or suppress their emotions, or on the other flip side, they might just, you know, exaggerate all their hurt, try and guilt their partner and get really clingy. And of course, as I just showed, like a lot of these, you know, damaging effects can also undermine the relationship. Oh, sorry. That was my cat. This is why I locked him out in the first place. So the destructive responses that insecure people have, you know, that can then damage the relationship well-being. But there's this process called partner buffering that can occur. And that's when the partner of an insecure individual engages in a way or enacts a certain kind of behavior that actually helps buffer or manage insecure people's destructive responses. And that can help insecure people have more satisfying relationships. Now, interestingly, there's been a lot of work done on this in the last 10 to 15 years. And you know, the short story is that people need to really kind of be in a very like loving and caring relationship environment in order to manage their insecurities. And a partner who provides support, provides affectionate touch, sexual frequency, is appreciative, shows gratitude, is willing to engage in relationship sacrifices, and display their commitment. These are just a short list of some of the behaviors that have been shown to buffer attachment anxiety and avoidance. Some of my own work that I don't really have time to go into today on social support highlights exactly this, that different levels of practical, emotional, and autonomy support is really important for buffering insecurities. And a lot of the work that I've done in this sort of domain, again, involves couples coming into the lab and having conversations that might be, challenging, and seeing how partners support an insecure person. But one of the things that has really been sort of puzzling to me is that this is a whole list of very different behaviors. It might become very difficult for partners to know what to engage in when they're trying to manage someone's insecurities in their relationship. So the question that it raises is that, what's the central ingredient? Is there one, defining thing that is very central? What's the mechanism for how people can buffer insecurities? What do all of these behaviors have in common? And to that, I sort of turned back to, what some of my papers have kind of found and what some of the theories would suggest. And it's about the consistent feeling of being loved and cared about. A lot of the reasons that people develop insecurities to begin with is because they are, experiencing a lack of love and care. And so relatedness need fulfillment is essentially a psychological process where people feel loved and cared about by close others. But I think consistently feeling that should be key to reducing attachment insecurities. So this is a paper that I recently published with Dr. Nicole Overall, who is actually my former PhD advisor. And in this study, it's a pretty humble study. It's 65 dyads in study 1 and 56 dyads in study 2. But these are established couples that completed, pretty intensive longitudinal data. And we had complete data across all of this. So in study 1, couples, both members of the couple completed a baseline questionnaire where we assessed their attachment anxiety and avoidance. They then completed a monthly questionnaire every month over 6 months, where they reported on their relatedness need fulfillment, whether they felt truly loved and cared about by their partner. And then at the end of that study, at 6 months, we again assessed both couple members' attachment anxiety and avoidance. In study 2, we had a very similar sort of procedure, but instead of getting sort of monthly assessments of relatedness need fulfillment, we had them reported every day over 21 days. So this was a daily diary study. And then 9 months later, we again had them re-report their attachment anxiety and avoidance. And what we were interested in here is whether consistent, average mean levels of relatedness need fulfillment across, these couples' sort of day-to-day interactions with their partner, whether that was sufficient in reducing their attachment anxiety and avoidance, helping them become more secure over time. Here's what we found for attachment anxiety. What we have on the x-axis is mean levels of relatedness need fulfillment over time. So this is for study 2. So this is, every day across 21 days. And then we also plotted it for people who reported, 1 standard deviation below that mean and 1 standard deviation above that mean. And our y-axis is the change in attachment anxiety over 9 months. So what we found here for attachment anxiety is that if people were reporting even mean levels of feeling loved and cared about by their partner, that was associated with a reduction in attachment anxiety over time. So this is controlling for their baseline levels. These are residualized changes in attachment anxiety over time. if people were reporting 1 standard deviation above the mean, that reduction was even more exaggerated. So the R values that you see reported, that's the effect size. So 1 standard deviation above the mean in relatedness need fulfillment consistently, day to day, is, leading to a reduction in attachment anxiety over a 9-month period. And that effect size is nearly 0.4. We found the same thing across both studies 1 and 2. This was a very replicable effect. This was the findings for attachment avoidance. Now here was slightly different, where if people were not feeling loved and cared about, so over here, the 1 standard deviation below the mean in relatedness need fulfillment, it actually made people more avoidant. So not only like what people, not feeling loved and cared about, but this was having a damaging effect and actually leading to greater, avoidant feelings. Mean levels of relatedness also didn't do anything. So it didn't help. It didn't, necessarily make things worse. But having a partner who made you feel really loved and cared about, that was 1 standard deviation above the group mean, again, that was associated with a huge decrease in attachment avoidance over a 9-month period. So across both of these studies, we were seeing that having a partner that can consistently make you feel, loved and cared about and foster feelings of relatedness need fulfillment, that was really central to helping, reduce people's insecurities over time. And I think what's really great about this, particular paper is that it shows that all of these different buffering behaviors that have been shown to work, there's specific strategies that may help do that. So when a partner provides you with support, of course, that makes you feel loved and cared about. When a partner is grateful and appreciative, of course, that makes you feel loved and cared about. But of course, this looks different for everybody. And I think the important thing to take away from it is that, we need to try and maintain closeness and intimacy with the partner. That, again, looks different for everybody. So even outside of context where you're trying to, be supportive or responsive to a partner, what can people actually do to help foster consistent relatedness need fulfillment? And this is actually an older study of mine, but it was a study that I think is quite relevant to this, because we asked couples how they maintain closeness and intimacy with their partner. In the first study, we had nearly 200 individuals give us different ways that they do this. And in the second study, we had 83 couples, 164 people tell us how they maintain closeness in their relationships. And what was great about this is that we were actually able to, qualitatively code various different types of shared relationship activities that people do. Things like, going on a getaway, so spending time together, going on some sort of holiday or a little trip over the weekend, engaging in sports activities together, dining together, watching movies, going shopping, talking, engaging in other common hobbies or social activities. There's a variety of different ways that people were engaging in, intimacy-inducing, closeness-inducing relationship activities. What was really important, though, is that what all of these activities had in common is that they were all partner-motivated activities. That's what was important in predicting, less stressful and more intimate activities. And knowing that a partner was dedicated to the activity actually helped predict better relationship quality over time. And I would be willing to bet that some of these might also help, with that, again, fostering that relationship environment that's very consistently loving and supportive, that can actually help people feel more secure. So those are a few examples of sort of the partner buffering work of how you can actually then cope with insecurities and the damaging effects of them in relationships. But, all of that sort of assumes that you have a partner who is able to do that and manage your insecurities. So another question that I've had more recently is whether insecure individuals can actually manage their own insecurities, without needing to necessarily rely on a partner that's going to do that for you. And so again, as a reminder, like if we think about attachment anxiety, you remember our couple, and Alex is really high in attachment anxiety. He engages in hyper emotion regulation strategies. So he's constantly exaggerating his hurt, his feelings. He might be very clingy, and relying a lot on his partner to tell them that they love him. And so one of the things that actually might be really helpful in managing Alex's insecure defenses and reactions is engaging in something called expressive suppression, which is an emotion regulation strategy where you suppress the outwardly expression of your emotions. So it's kind of like an iceberg. It's not that you're not feeling those things, but you're only letting a little bit of it show. For someone who's high in attachment anxiety, who's constantly exaggerating their emotions, engaging in expressive suppression and pulling that back a little bit might be a very effective tool that highly anxious individuals can use that can be beneficial for their partner. So I tested this hypothesis in 3 dyadic studies of nearly 270 couples. Across all these 3 studies, couples either completed a daily diary every day for 21 days, or in 2 other studies, they actually came into the lab and had support relevant discussions with their partner. This is just one example from study 2, but I got pretty similar effects across all the studies. So what we have here is a support provider's expressive suppression on the x-axis, and then their partner's perceived responsiveness on the y. And this pink line are people who are low in attachment anxiety. So these are relatively more secure individuals. And what we find here is that, as people provided really high levels or engaged in high levels of expressive suppression, this tended to be bad for their partners. Their partners felt like the provider was being less responsive to their needs. But when these providers were high in attachment anxiety and engaging in greater expressive suppression, their partners actually felt that they were being more responsive to their needs. We got a very similar outcome when we looked at overall discussion success. For someone who was more secure, expressive suppression was actually really bad for their partner. But for an anxious person, engaging in expressive suppression was actually really beneficial for their partner. Their partner felt more supported. Their partner felt like those discussions went really well. And we got similar outcomes when we also looked at day-to-day relationship satisfaction. For highly anxious people, engaging in expressive suppression was benefiting their partner. Because I think what it was doing was giving their partner a little bit of a break from the exaggerated emotions that they typically have to deal with when they're dealing with someone who's high in attachment anxiety. On the flip side of that, you remember, Morgan, she's high in attachment avoidance. She tends to engage in hyper emotion regulation, which means that she tends to actually keep her emotions in. She doesn't sort of put her heart on her sleeve. She doesn't show her vulnerability to her partner, Alex. So in this situation, it might be actually beneficial for Morgan to provide a little bit more of that, demonstrate a little bit more of that vulnerability. And so in 3 dyadic studies of 246 couples, I tested whether reassurance seeking by people who are high in attachment avoidance might again be beneficial for their partner. Across these 3 studies, we actually coded, we watched the videotape recordings and we rated individuals' reassurance seeking behaviors during support discussions. And this behavior is really interesting because it involves seeking really explicit feedback from partners about whether, people feel loved, whether they're valued, whether they're worthy, whether the partner really loves them, if the partner is really committed to their relationship. So this can also be, it can be sort of viewed as sort of almost like fishing for compliments or fishing for, security from the partner. But what it does is that it highlights that these individuals care about that and they care about what the partner thinks, which for someone who's high in attachment avoidance, they typically don't engage in these types of behaviors. And so when they do, it might again be very good for their partner. So we actually found these effects consistently across all 3 studies. We had done a meta-analysis across all of these findings. And so here is the meta-analytic effect of that interaction. And this is essentially when people engaged in reassurance seeking, did their partners respond positively by engaging in support? Now, what we found is that for people who are low in attachment avoidance, so again, these are relatively secure individuals, when they engaged in reassurance seeking, it wasn't associated with whether their partners, were responsive and provided support. But when people were high in attachment avoidance and they engaged in reassurance seeking, their partners actually engaged in much more support. They were being responsive, they were providing more practical support, advice, and guidance. What was really interesting about this particular study is that in study 3, we also tested what we thought was an important mediator, which was whether the partner actually felt valued by the highly avoidant person. And we got a very similar interaction, and we had our mediation analyses showed that that indirect effect was significant. So what was happening here is when highly avoidant people who typically don't show their vulnerability, when they actually opened up to their partner by engaging in reassurance seeking, their partners felt more valued and close to them. And because of that, they were able to be more responsive and supportive towards them, towards the highly avoidant person. So those are just 2 examples of things that insecure individuals are doing in their relationships for themselves to help cultivate, a better relationship, even just for their partner. But also, I'm getting close to my time here, but I wanted to touch a little bit also on single people. Because for most of my talk, I've been talking about Alex and Morgan, who are in a romantic relationship. But of course, single people have insecurities too. And often people are single before they get into a relationship. And after their relationship ends, people find themselves single again. So attachment insecurities aren't just something that people carry with them when they're only in a relationship. It's something that's with us all the time. And I think understanding insecurities with single people is really important. This is actually not one of my papers. It's a paper done by Dr. Bill Chopik and his colleagues. And here they actually were looking at the developmental trajectories of attachment anxiety and avoidance over time. And you can see here, the levels of it tend to be relatively stable over time. There are a few sort of developmental points where things change a little bit. But I think what was interesting in this paper for someone like me who studies both singles and couples is that they reported it separately for single people and partnered people. And what you can see here is that even though the trajectory looked the same regardless of relationship status, what you see is that single people, they tended to be much higher in attachment anxiety and avoidance compared to coupled people. And, this was a very well done study. It's nearly 9,000 people aged 18 to 70. Now, I'm not suggesting that all single people are insecure. In fact, I recently published a paper with Jeff McDonald, who I think some of you would have heard talk a few weeks ago to your group, and Dr. Yuban Park, where we were really arguing that there's a lot of variability even among single people. So we reviewed a whole lot of literature looking at single people's well-being outcomes and identified that there are a lot of single people who might be struggling, but there are also a lot of single people who are thriving. So one of the things when we sort of apply this to attachment is trying to understand the variability of what insecurities look like even among a single population. And so a paper that this is being actually led by Chris Pepping, but it's a paper that we have under review right now of two studies of two samples of 482 single college students and then 400 long-term single adults who'd been single at least 3 years. And in both of these studies, they completed attachment measures as well as a whole host of psychosocial well-being indicators. And what we did in both of these studies is we ran a latent class analysis. And we actually identified different groups of secure, anxious, avoidant. And I know I haven't talked too much about it, but also the fearful category. These were highly consistent and loaded, very well. They were consistent with attachment theory. What I do find interesting is that, earlier on in the talk, I told you about how if you take a look at the overall population, there's about 60% of secure adults. In our single group, we're finding a much lower rate of security. So I think that's something worth kind of thinking about, and probably why those mean levels are so much higher, because it seems like insecurities might be a little bit more, rampant in a single population. And I think that that could be for various reasons, which we can talk about later if people are interested. But so I think that was important. But when single people were secure, they had the best psychosocial outcomes out of all of the other, single individuals. They were much more satisfied with their life. Their life gave them more meaning. They were more satisfied in their relationships with close others. They felt more supported by their family and friends. They had, more satisfaction with their sex life. I think, except the only trumped by our avoidant individuals. They felt more autonomous and they were much less likely to fear singlehood. So I think this is really important to note, right? Because we see the damaging effects of insecurities, not just in relationships, but I think also in singlehood. But it is important to know that if we can sort of help push single people into the sort of secure category, that they can actually lead very thriving lives. So that has really important implications. So I'll wrap up here. I've talked to you today about how fluctuations in attachment insecurity can really undermine personal and interpersonal consequences, right? It can undermine people's ability to regulate their emotions, and it can have damaging effects for their relationship well-being. I also talked about how this doesn't mean that insecure people are doomed, right? We have shown that romantic partners can engage in buffering behaviors that help manage insecure people's defenses and foster security over time. But I also wanted to kind of hint at the fact that, individuals who are insecure can actually temper their own insecure tendencies without relying on the partner. And that can be a really good thing. It can help foster a more satisfying and supportive relationship when we take a look at those partner effects and those dyadic outcomes. And finally, although I've talked a lot about, relationships and coupled relationships, that even single people can be at risk for greater insecurities. But if single people are secure, then, they show some of the best outcomes when it comes to personal and interpersonal outcomes in their life. So with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. I know it's coming towards the end of your days today. I also want to thank my lab, the Secure Lab, for all of the support, a lot of the funding agencies. Again, I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people in the Tangata Whenua, whose lands a lot of this research has been conducted on. And then also, if anyone wants to connect with any of my research team or myself, or any of the work that we're doing, the sort of various forms that you can kind of check out our website. I have a social Instagram account, and then of course you can reach out to me on email or Twitter, and I'd be happy to take any questions now as well.